This playlist collects together and organizes the individual component modules, which together will comprise our lecture covering Kornblith's introduction to his 2001 volume on the internalism-externalism debate. Since this is a relatively slow week for us in the class, I want to take a moment to look at where we are and what we've been doing for the past couple of weeks. We'll talk about 3 different threads we've been pulling on throughout the literature and how they have a common nexus in the contemplation of the role, nature, and significance of metacognitive appraisals of beliefs and belief-forming processes. Then we'll talk a little bit about how these various debates that we've been talking about are largely conducted in isolation from one another. How people in one literature may also be in another literature, but in the context of writing on one particular topic, they tend not to refer to or portray as interconnected their work in other related topics, some of the other threads that we've looked at. I'm going to suggest that this is a fundamental flaw in the literature because these topics are in fact interrelated. Then we'll turn to the actual meat of Kornblith's introduction. We'll talk a little bit about the historic development of the debate in the 80s, the use of the terms internalism and externalism, the typical motivations that are offered for the positions. Finally, I'll end the lecture by suggesting that while the theoretical differences seem stark and dramatic, that practically speaking, there are very few cases that can't be accommodated by both views, so that the literature tends to focus on this very small group of relatively atypical cases as the sole determinant of the distinction between these two views. So let's focus in on this first part here. We want to look at these 3 threads that we've been pulling on in thinking about some of the papers and topics that we've been talking about for the last few weeks. We've been thinking about the skeptical challenge since the very beginning of the class. I'm going to suggest, or maybe just notice, that I think that progress has been made with Quine's explicit ontological relativity when we talked about Quine and his response to the skeptic. We talked about the problem of original justification. That is, if we think that justification can be transferred via inference, we still run into this problem of how does justification actually get into that belief edifice in order to be transferred. Inference seems only capable of transferring. It doesn't seem capable of actually originating justification. And here we've suggested that reliabilism appears to offer a solution to this problem, though it's certainly a solution that's not universally embraced. And finally, we contemplated these Gettier-type problems. And we've wondered whether these Gettier-type problems are in fact illustrative of a different underlying problem that people tend not to focus on when trying to deal with Gettier cases. And in fact, I think all of these problems ultimately turn upon how one understands the role, the nature, and the significance of metacognitive appraisal of our beliefs and our belief-forming processes. To what extent do we have to follow Bonger's prescriptions about maintaining a cognitive awareness, or at least an implicit awareness of the tacit availability of these sorts of metacognitive appraisals of our belief-forming processes and the evidence upon which we form our beliefs in order to be epistemically praiseworthy in the way that we conduct our intellectual lives? I will suggest that all of these problems actually turn on this particular issue, and in fact that the internalism-externalism debate turns on these issues as well and involves the 3 threads that we've been talking about. Finally, I'll end this part of the lecture by noting the oddness of Kornblith's 2 anthologies. He has an anthology, a highly respected anthology on naturalized epistemology. He has a highly respected anthology on the internalism and externalism debate. These are clearly 2 topics that he has significant interest in, and yet they exist as totally independent entities from one another. There really is no crosstalk between these projects at all, and I want to suggest that there's something strange about that, and that it seems indicative of the literature and how it approaches these debates as though they're insulated and isolated from one another, such that the outcome of one debate may or may not have any impact at all on the outcome of another debate, and how this, in fact, seems indicative of much of this literature and of how these issues are thought about in isolation from one another, even by thinkers who publish across multiple areas. Let's begin. If I had to pick a meme for introductory or survey classes like this, it would probably be this bit from Monty Python where Tim the Enchanter comes out of nowhere and announces, "And now for something completely different." It may seem like we're just hopping from randomly selected topic to randomly selected topic without any coherent underlying issue, but that's really not the case. And what I'm going to try and do before we turn our attention to Kornbluth's Introduction to the Internalism-Externalism debate is show how we've been pulling on these different threads for quite some time in the class, but they all have a common nexus. They're all really different ways of viewing the same issue. And in fact, the internalism-externalism debate is yet another instance of trying to view that issue from a different angle. So as I've suggested, I think that we've been pulling on some threads in the epistemic literature for some time now. Probably the thread we've been pulling on the longest has been the skeptical challenge itself. We originally started thinking about the skeptical challenge all the way back when we read the Theaetetus in the beginning of the term. It certainly loomed large when we read Descartes, and it's been out there in the background for all this time, sometimes more prominent than other times, but always there. And I think that we've made progress when we read Quine. Quine, as I read him, explicitly advocates that we acknowledge our ontological commitments, and moreover that we acknowledge that epistemic theories and challenges to epistemic theories are inherently bound to commitments, that we cannot engage in epistemic theorizing, or for that matter, critical or skeptical speculation independent of commitments. And so we should instead recognize that we have those commitments, acknowledge that our theories are dependent upon them, and then begin building our theories about the nature and extent of human knowledge through our understanding of the mind, the world, and how minds interact with the world. And if I'm right about Quine, this fundamentally alters the nature of the skeptical challenge. The skeptical challenge that we see in Descartes, especially in his evil demon, dreaming, and illusion arguments, is a challenge of a zero-sum game. We have no right to our beliefs if we cannot demonstrate definitively that the skeptic is wrong a priori, without any suppositions at all. So we, in effect, have to refute the skeptic no matter how the world is, no matter how our minds are, and no matter how our minds interact with the world. If Quine is right, then we make progress by recognizing that this isn't, in fact, what we're doing, that we have a hypothesis about the nature of the mind, the nature of the world, and the nature of the interaction between the two. And the skeptic is offering us an alternative hypothesis. And what we're engaged in when we engage with the skeptic is an exercise in theory choice, employing the criterion that are not unfamiliar to us at all. Things such as explanatory power, predictive power, evidential merit. When we conceive of the skeptical challenge in this way, Quine suggests, the skeptic is definitely at a disadvantage, because these hypotheses are barely coherent. In a similar fashion, we've been contemplating for a while now how justification might originate. We've been assuming that inference is capable of transferring justifications from beliefs to other beliefs, but the regress argument has shown us that it provides no mechanism through which justification can originate. And all parties in that debate, both the foundationalists and the coherentists, seem to acknowledge this to some degree. And here too, I think we've made some progress. The introduction of this notion of reliability, here I'm showing Armstrong, but of course we have Goldman, we have Sousa, we have Kornbluth. The suggestion that reliabilism provides a mechanism whereby justification might originate, precisely because we don't have to make inferences, explicit conscious connections between beliefs between theory and evidence over which justification can travel. Instead, natural, automatic, mechanistic processes make those connections reliably, and our need to see the connections is rendered moot by the fact that we're configured such that we act as if those connections are there. Now, this doesn't prevent us from engaging in a metacognitive evaluation of those processes or those beliefs, but this is a separate process from the process of belief formation. And this is the real point of contention, as we'll see in the internalism-externalism debate. Is it possible for justification to be rendered automatically by the nature of the processes that generate our beliefs? We'll continue with this discussion in the next lecture module.